Arthur Kellerman had been standing at gate C-14 for 11
You may
minutes
proceed
when
to
the
the
agent
aircraft now,
called
sir.
his name over the intercom and asked him to step to the counter. And he already knew from 79 years of learning how these things went that whatever came next was not going to be good news dressed up as an apology. He was right. The flight was oversold. A seat needed to be freed in first class, and though Arthur's ticket was entirely valid, redeemed with miles he'd been saving for 3 years, the only splurge he'd allowed himself since his wife passed, the gate agent looked at his frayed canvas duffel bag, his worn corduroy jacket, and the quiet, unhurried way he'd been standing off to the side instead of hovering at the counter demanding priority boarding, and made a calculation she never would have said out loud, but had already made anyway. "Mr. Kellerman, we're going to need to reseat you in our main cabin today. We do apologize for the inconvenience." He didn't argue. He picked up his bag and walked down the jet bridge toward a coach seat. The way a man walks when he has spent a very long life being moved to make room for someone else, and had decided sometime around his 60th birthday that dignity did not require winning every argument about where you were allowed to sit before we find out what happened 40 minutes later. In the cockpit of that same aircraft, we need a minute to understand exactly who had just been quietly bumped to seat 34C, and why it would matter more than anyone on that jet bridge could have guessed. Arthur Kellerman was 79 years old, and for 31 years, until arthritis in both hands ended it for good, he had run a single runway grass airstrip 40 minutes outside a small Midwestern town, teaching anyone who wanted to learn to fly, charging what people could afford, which for a lot of the kids who showed up at his hangar door on bicycles was nothing at all. He had been an Air Force flight instructor for 22 years before that, had trained pilots who went on to fly everything from cargo planes to fighter jets, and had kept in a metal filing cabinet in his hangar office a logbook for every single student he had ever taught, 43 years of names in his own careful handwriting. One of those names belonged to a 15-year-old boy who had shown up at Arthur's hangar on a bicycle in the autumn of 1994, angry, skinny, living with an alcoholic father in a trailer 2 miles down the county road, looking for anywhere that wasn't home. Arthur had found him standing at the fence line, watching a Cessna practice touch and goes, and instead of telling him to move along, had asked if he wanted to see the inside of the cockpit. The boy's name was Daniel Reyes. Arthur taught him to fly for free over the following 3 years. Not because he had money to spare, he didn't. Not really. But because he recognized something in that boy that reminded him of a version of himself he didn't talk about much. A kid who needed one adult to believe a bigger life was possible before he could believe it himself. Daniel Reyes joined the Air Force at 18, flew for 11 years, and left to fly commercially, working his way from regional carriers to a major airline over the following decade. He was 45 years old now, and he had not spoken to Arthur Kellerman in 26 years, not out of any falling out, but the ordinary erosion of a life lived fast and far from where it started, deployments and moves and the slow accumulation of years that turn "I'll call him soon" into a decade. Then Captain Daniel Reyes reviewed the boarding manifest in the cockpit that afternoon the way he did before every flight. a routine scan of names that meant nothing most days. On this particular Tuesday, seat 34C stopped him cold. Before we continue, if you believe that the people who shape us quietly, decades before we understand what they gave us, deserve to be remembered when it costs us nothing to do it, please like this video, subscribe to Kindness Tailies, and share this with someone who needs to believe in people again today. Daniel stared at the name for a long moment. Certain it had to be a coincidence. Kellerman wasn't an especially rare name until he pulled up the passenger's date of birth against a memory that had never actually left him. Arthur Kellerman, born the same year, the same month, that Daniel had once memorized off a selective service card taped inside Arthur's hangar office. The year Arthur used to joke was the same year they invented good sense, which is why I've got so little of it. It was him. Daniel sat in the cockpit for a moment with his hand over his mouth, running the arithmetic of 26 years of silence against a debt he had never once stopped owing. Then he unbuckled, told his first officer he'd be back in 5 minutes, and walked out of the cockpit and down the aisle of his own aircraft, past business class, past the curtain into coach, scanning row numbers until he found 34C Arthur. Kellerman was sitting by the window with his duffel bag wedged under the seat in front of him, reading glasses low on his nose, working a crossword puzzle with the patient economy of a man who had made peace a long time ago with wherever he happened to be sitting. "Mr. Kellerman," Daniel said. Arthur looked up, mildly surprised to see a captain's uniform standing in his row, the way any passenger would be. It took him a second longer than it had taken Daniel. Then his eyes changed. "Danny Reyes," Arthur said slowly, like he was checking the words against a memory to make sure they still fit. "Good Lord, look at you." "You taught me everything," Daniel said, and found, to his own surprise, that his voice had gone thick around the words. "Every single thing I know about flying you gave me for free, out of a hangar with a leaking roof, because I was a 15-year-old kid with nowhere else to be." "You were a good student," Arthur said. Impatient. "What good? They bumped you to coach." "Wasn't the end of the world," Arthur said easily. "I've sat in worse seats." "Not on my aircraft." "You haven't." Daniel crouched down beside the row, ignoring the flight attendant hovering a few feet away, ignoring the small audience of passengers who had started to notice something was happening. "I need you to come with me." The gate had already closed, but first class had one seat still empty, the seat Arthur had originally been ticketed for, the one nobody else had claimed after the reshuffle, a fact the gate agent had somehow failed to mention when she moved him. Daniel walked Arthur up the aisle himself, carried his duffel bag with his own hands, and settled him into 2A with the specific, deliberate care of a man writing something that should never have needed writing in the first place. "I owe you a phone call I never made," Daniel said, still crouched beside the seat, delaying a takeoff by 4 minutes that no one on that aircraft would ever complain about, once they understood why. 26 years of one. "I'm sorry. It took an airline mistake to fix it." Arthur looked at him for a long moment. 79 years of a face that didn't perform emotion so much as let it arrive quietly. You flew fighters. You flew cargo. Now you're flying 200 people across the country, and you still remembered an old man's name on a manifest. He shook his head slightly. I'd call that a good return on a leaking hangar roof. Daniel had to stand up and walk back to the cockpit before it cost him his composure entirely. He learned, over the course of that flight, relayed through the first officer, who checked on Arthur twice at Daniel's quiet request that the grass airstrip had closed 6 years earlier when Arthur's hands could no longer manage the paperwork and the hangar's roof had finally failed for good. Uninsured, unrepaired, the free-flying lessons ending not because Arthur stopped wanting to give them, but because the building that housed them had run out of years. Arthur was flying to see the funeral of a former Air Force wingman. Alone, in a jacket he'd owned since before Daniel was born, having spent 3 years of careful saving on the miles for the ticket, Daniel met him at baggage claim after the flight, off duty out of uniform, and asked him a question he'd been turning over for the last 2 hours in the cockpit. If the hangar was rebuilt properly, insured a real program, would you come back and run it? Not alone. With help. My help, if you'd have it. Arthur studied him for a long moment. You'd do that. I owe it to every kid on a bicycle who hasn't shown up at that fence line yet, Daniel said. You did it for one. I want to make sure it's still there to do it for the next one. 8 months later, the Kellerman Flight Foundation broke ground on a rebuilt hangar and a new grass strip 40 minutes outside that same Midwestern town. Funded in part by Daniel Reyes and a handful of other pilots who, once they heard the story, remembered their own version of a fence line and an adult who hadn't told them to move along. Arthur ran it 3 days a week, hands too stiff now to fly solo, but sharp enough to teach from the right seat. A new logbook open on his desk, the first name already written in his own careful hand. If this story moved you, please like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to Kindness Tales for more stories of courage, grace, and the small human moments that change everything. And tell us in the comments, is there someone who shaped you quietly years ago that you still owe a phone call?